The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of New Mexico Territory in 1885. Water meant life, and life meant survival. For one stubborn rancher, what started as a simple trip to the spring would become a legend whispered around campfires for generations. This is the true story of how a single encounter with a towering Apache woman would spark a chain of events that brought 300 of the most feared warriors in the Southwest to surround one man's ranch. It's a tale of courage, cultural clash, and the thin line between respect and war in the untamed American frontier. What happened next would test everything he believed about survival, honor, and the price of standing your ground when the odds are impossibly stacked against you. Some say he was a fool. Others call him a hero. But everyone agrees on one thing: what transpired over those 5 days changed the landscape of the Southwest forever. Samuel Sam Hartwell had been working his ranch in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains for 3 years when everything changed. The 42-year-old former cavalry officer had chosen this remote corner of New Mexico Territory specifically because it was far from civilization, far from the memories of the war, and far from anyone who might ask too many questions about the scars that crisscrossed his back and the nightmares that still woke him most nights. His ranch was modest by any standard: a weathered adobe house, a small barn, and enough grazing land for his 50 head of cattle. But it was his, bought with his own savings and built with his own hands. The most precious resource on his property wasn't the cattle or the land itself, but the reliable spring that bubbled up from deep underground about half a mile from his house. Devil's Spring, the locals called it, though Sam had never understood why. The water ran clear and cold even in the harshest summer months, and it had never failed him. On that fateful Tuesday morning in August, Sam loaded his wagon with empty barrels as he had done countless times before. The routine was always the same: drive out to the spring before the day got too hot, fill the barrels, and haul them back to the ranch. His cattle would need the water, and so would he. In this unforgiving landscape, water wasn't just important, it was everything. The morning air still held a hint of coolness as Sam guided his 2 horses along the familiar path. Prairie dogs scattered at the sound of the wagon wheels, and a red-tailed hawk circled lazily overhead. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. Sam allowed himself to relax slightly, something he rarely did. The Apache raids that had terrorized the territory for years had been quiet lately, and he'd begun to hope that maybe the worst was behind them. He should have known better. As he crested the small rise that overlooked Devil's Spring, Sam pulled back on the reins and stared in disbelief. Someone was already there. Not just someone, a woman. But this wasn't any ordinary woman he might expect to encounter in the wilderness. She stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a presence that commanded attention even from a distance. Her long black hair hung loose down her back, and she wore traditional Apache clothing, a doeskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments that caught the morning light. What struck Sam most wasn't her imposing height, but the way she carried herself. There was no fear in her posture, no surprise at his approach. She stood beside the spring as if she owned it, as if she had every right to be there. Which, Sam realized with a growing sense of unease, she probably believed she did. The woman was filling what appeared to be traditional Apache water containers, tightly woven baskets sealed with pine pitch. She worked methodically, efficiently, never taking her eyes off Sam as he sat frozen in his wagon seat. Her gaze wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was evaluating, measuring, deciding. Sam's mind raced through his options. He could turn around and leave, come back later when she was gone. That would be the smart thing to do. But something in him rebelled at the idea. This was his land, his spring. He'd paid good money for it, had the deed to prove it. More than that, his cattle were depending on this water. If he started backing down now, where would it end? Slowly, carefully, Sam climbed down from the wagon. He kept his hands visible and well away from the rifle that lay across the seat. He'd learned enough about Apache customs during his cavalry days to know that sudden movements and aggressive gestures could escalate a situation faster than a man could blink. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet space between them. The woman said nothing at first, just continued filling her containers. When she finally spoke, her voice was deep and carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You are on Apache land, she said in heavily accented but clear English. Sam felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard this argument before, from various Apache bands who claimed ancestral rights to lands that had been legally purchased from the territorial government. The problem was, both sides had legitimate points. The government had been selling land that various Apache groups had used for generations, often without bothering to consult the people who considered it sacred. I have papers, Sam replied, keeping his voice level. Bought this land fair and square from the territorial office in Tucson. The woman straightened to her full, impressive height and fixed him with a stare that seemed to look right through him. White man's papers mean nothing to the spirits of this place. This spring has been used by my people since before your grandfathers were born. There was truth in what she said, and Sam knew it. But there was also truth in his position. He'd followed the law, paid his money, and worked hard to build something here. He wasn't about to give it up without a fight, even if that fight was with a woman who looked like she could snap him in half without much effort. Look, Sam said, taking a step closer but keeping his hands visible, I'm not looking for trouble. There's enough water here for both of us. You take what you need, I'll take what I need. No reason we can't share. The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. She finished filling her last container and secured it carefully before turning her full attention to Sam. I am Nailnish, she said, using what Sam assumed was her Apache name. In your language, you would call me She Who Brings Rain. I am sister to Cochise's son, cousin to Geronimo. This water flows from the sacred places where my ancestors pray. Sam's blood ran cold. He'd heard of her, though the stories had always seemed too fantastical to believe. She Who Brings Rain was said to be a medicine woman of tremendous power, a warrior who had fought alongside the greatest Apache leaders. Some stories claimed she could control the weather, others that she could speak with the spirits of the dead. What all the stories agreed on was that she was not someone to cross lightly. I'm Sam Hartwell, he replied, figuring it was only polite to introduce himself properly. I fought with the cavalry for a while, but I'm just trying to ranch now. Trying to build something peaceful. Nailnish studied him for a long moment, as if reading something written in his face that others couldn't see. You have the look of a man who has seen too much death, she said finally. The spirits whisper around you. They are not quiet. Sam didn't know how to respond to that. It was true enough, he had seen too much death, done things during the Apache wars that still haunted him. But he'd put that life behind him when he left the cavalry. Or at least, he'd tried to. That's in the past, he said quietly. I just want to water my cattle and live in peace. Peace, Nailnish repeated, as if the word had a bitter taste. Your people speak much of peace while they take our lands, kill our men, steal our children. What peace did you offer when you wore the blue coat? The question hit Sam like a physical blow. He'd participated in actions during the wars that he wasn't proud of, had followed orders that still made his stomach turn when he thought about them. But he'd also tried to be better than some of the men he'd served with, had tried to maintain some sense of honor even in the midst of brutal conflict. I did what I thought was right at the time, he said finally. Maybe I was wrong about some things. Maybe we all were. Something in his tone seemed to reach her, because Nailnish's aggressive posture relaxed slightly. She gathered her water containers, balancing them with an ease that belied their obvious weight. You will not fence this spring, she said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. You will not post signs claiming ownership of what cannot be owned. The water flows free, as it always has. Sam considered this. It wasn't an unreasonable request, and it might prevent bigger problems down the road. He had no intention of fencing the spring anyway. It would be more trouble than it was worth, and it might interfere with the natural flow of water. Agreed, he said. But I water my cattle here, and I take what I need for the ranch. That doesn't change. Nailnish nodded once, sharply. The water belongs to all living things. Your cattle may drink, as may mine. As may all who come in need. With that, she began walking away, moving with surprising grace despite her size and the heavy containers she carried. Sam watched her go, noting that she headed north toward the rougher country where he knew various Apache bands still maintained hidden camps. As she reached the edge of his vision, Nailnish turned back. Her voice carried easily across the distance between them. "You are not like the other white men who have come here," she called out. "That may save your life. But it will not save you from what is coming." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What's coming?" he called back. But Nailnish was already disappearing into the scrub brush and rock formations that dotted the landscape. Sam stood alone by the spring, her words echoing in his mind. What had she meant? Was it a threat, or a warning? He filled his water barrels mechanically, his mind churning over the encounter. He'd heard enough stories about Apache prophecies and medicine woman predictions to know they weren't usually idle threats. If Nailnish said something was coming, there was probably good reason to believe her. The trip back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, and Sam found himself constantly scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The landscape that had seemed peaceful an hour earlier now felt charged with potential danger. Every shadow could hide a warrior, every rock formation could conceal an ambush. But nothing happened. Sam reached his ranch without incident, unloaded the water barrels, and went about his daily routine. He fed his cattle, repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by wind, and tried to convince himself that the encounter at the spring had been nothing more than an unusual but ultimately harmless meeting. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn towards something he wasn't prepared for. Nailnish's words kept running through his mind, "You are not like the other white men who have come here. That may save your life. But it will not save you from what is coming." What was coming? And why did he get the distinct impression that his peaceful days of ranching were about to come to an abrupt end? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and when it did, it would test everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and survival in the unforgiving landscape of the American Southwest. Sam Hartwell had no way of knowing it, but his encounter with the giant Apache woman at Devil's Spring had just set in motion a chain of events that would become legend. As he finally headed inside for the night, Sam made a mental note to clean and oil his rifle. Something told him he was going to need it. The next 3 days passed without incident, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't anything he could point to specifically, no movement in the brush, no signs of horses or footprints around his property. Just an itch between his shoulder blades that suggested eyes were tracking his every move. His cattle seemed nervous too, clustering closer together than usual and startling at sounds that normally wouldn't bother them. Even his horses were acting strange, whinnying softly at shadows and refusing to graze in certain areas where they'd always been comfortable before. On Friday morning, Sam decided to ride out to check his fences in the far pasture. It was work that needed doing anyway, and it would give him a chance to scout around his property boundaries. If someone was watching him, maybe he could spot some sign of their presence. He saddled his best horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Chief, and rode out just after sunrise. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching day ahead. As he rode, Sam's eyes constantly swept the landscape, looking for anything out of the ordinary. About 2 miles from his house, he found what he was looking for, and immediately wished he hadn't. Horseshoe prints. Lots of them. Unshod pony tracks mixed in with what looked like prints from at least a dozen different horses. The tracks were relatively fresh, probably made within the last day or two, and they formed a rough circle around his entire property. Sam's mouth went dry as he followed the trail. Someone, multiple someones, had been systematically scouting his ranch. They'd stayed just outside his property lines, but they'd covered every approach, every escape route, every defensive position. It was the kind of reconnaissance that preceded either a major raid or a siege. The tracks told a story that made Sam's blood run cold. These weren't casual raiders looking for easy cattle to steal. This was organized, methodical, and thorough. Whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing, and they'd taken their time to do it right. As he continued following the trail, Sam noticed something else that made his stomach clench. Some of the tracks were huge, much larger than normal horse prints. They had to have been made by exceptionally big animals, the kind of war horses that only the most important Apache leaders rode. Near what appeared to be an observation post overlooking his ranch house, Sam found something that made his hands shake as he dismounted to examine it more closely. Stuck in the bark of a dead mesquite tree was an arrow. Not shot there in anger or as a threat, but carefully placed as a message. The arrow was beautifully made, with eagle feathers and intricate painted designs on the shaft. The arrowhead was steel, not flint, and sharp enough to shave with. Tied just below the feathers was a small piece of buckskin with symbols painted on it in what looked like a mixture of red ochre and charcoal. Sam couldn't read Apache pictographs, but he didn't need to. The message was clear enough: we see you. We know where you are. We are watching. He pulled the arrow from the tree and studied it more closely. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of work that took considerable skill and time. This wasn't some young warrior's practice arrow, it was made by someone who knew their craft intimately. Someone important enough to have arrows this fine. Mounting Chief again, Sam rode back toward his ranch house at a considerably faster pace than he'd used on the way out. His mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. The logical thing to do would be to pack up his essentials and head for the nearest town until whatever was brewing had blown over. But the thought of abandoning his ranch, his hard-won independence, made him physically sick. This place represented everything he'd worked for since leaving the cavalry. It was his fresh start, his chance to build something meaningful with his own hands. More than that, it was his home. The first real home he'd had since he was a boy growing up on his father's farm in Ohio. As his house came into view, Sam noticed something that made him rein Chief to a stop. Smoke was rising from his chimney. Not much smoke, just a thin wisp, but enough to be clearly visible against the blue sky. Sam hadn't lit a fire that morning. He hadn't lit a fire in days, not with the temperature already climbing toward what promised to be another blazing hot afternoon. Someone was in his house. Sam's first instinct was to turn around and write for help, but the nearest neighbor was more than 20 miles away, and the nearest town was twice that distance. By the time he could get back with assistance, whoever was in his house would be long gone, along with anything valuable they could carry. Instead, Sam circled around to approach his house from the side where he'd have the best view of the front door and windows. He tied Chief to a sturdy bush about 100 yards away and continued on foot, moving as quietly as his boots would allow on the rocky ground. As he got closer, Sam could smell something cooking. Meat, from the smell of it, and something else he couldn't immediately identify. Whoever was inside wasn't just hiding, they were making themselves at home. Sam crept up to his kitchen window and carefully peered inside. What he saw nearly made him curse out loud in surprise. Nailnish sat at his kitchen table, calmly eating what appeared to be a stew made from one of his chickens. She'd built a small fire in his fireplace and used his own pots and utensils to prepare the meal. Her massive frame looked almost comical squeezed into one of his wooden chairs, but there was nothing funny about the rifle that lay across the table within easy reach of her right hand. She looked up as if she'd sensed his presence and spoke without turning toward the window. "Come inside, Sam Hartwell. We need to talk." Sam hesitated for a moment, then walked around to his front door. It was standing slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "Make yourself at home," he said dryly, looking around at his invaded kitchen. Nailnish actually smiled at that, a quick flash of white teeth that transformed her stern features. "Your chicken was getting old. I saved you the trouble of butchering it." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Sam found himself almost grinning. There was something audacious about her casual attitude that he couldn't help but admire, even if it was directed at his property. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Sam asked, settling into the chair across from her. The rifle on the table was his own, he noticed. She must have taken it from the rack by the door. Nailnish's expression grew serious again. "My cousin Geronimo has returned from the south. He brings with him warriors from many bands, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Lipan. They are angry about the treaty violations, about the children taken to the white man's schools, about the sacred places that have been defiled." Sam felt his stomach drop. Geronimo's name was enough to strike fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. The Apache leader had been fighting the white invasion for decades, and his raids had become the stuff of legend and nightmare. "What does that have to do with me?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You are white. You are on Apache land." "That is enough for most of the warriors," Nailnish replied, spooning more stew into her mouth. "But there are other reasons. 3 days ago, soldiers from Fort Bowie attacked a peaceful camp near the Dragoons. Women and children were killed. The survivors fled here, to the sacred places." Sam closed his eyes. He'd heard rumors about increased military activity in the area, but he'd hoped the reports were exaggerated. "Apparently not. I'm not a soldier anymore," he said quietly. "I had nothing to do with any attack." "You think that matters to a father whose child was shot down while playing with corn dolls?" Nailnish's voice carried an edge of anger now. "You think grief knows the difference between the man who pulled the trigger and the man who shares his skin color?" She was right, and Sam knew it. In times like these, nuance was a luxury few could afford. People looked for targets for their rage, and he was a convenient one. "So what happens now?" Sam asked. Nailnish pushed her bowl away and leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under her weight. "Now you have a choice. You can run, like most white men would. Pack your belongings and flee to your towns and forts. Live with the knowledge that you abandoned your home when it mattered most. Or you can stay and prove that you are different from the others. Show that you have the courage to stand by your words about peace and sharing the water." Sam studied her face, looking for any hint of what she was really thinking. "And if I stay? What then?" "Then, you will be tested. My people will come, many of them. They will surround your ranch and wait to see what kind of man you truly are. If you show fear, if you reach for weapons, if you try to call for your soldiers, you will die. Your cattle will be taken, your buildings burned, your name forgotten. And if I don't do those things?" Nailnish was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the mountains. "Then, perhaps you will live to see another sunrise. Perhaps you will earn the respect of warriors who have fought the white man for longer than you have been alive. Perhaps you will become something more than just another landgrabber who thought he could buy sacred places with paper money." Sam felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "How many warriors are we talking about?" "Enough," was all Nailnish said. She stood up, her head nearly brushing the ceiling of his kitchen. "They will come at dawn. Be ready." "Ready for what, exactly?" "To choose who you really are," she replied, gathering up her water containers from where she'd left them by the door. "Your people have a saying, actions speak louder than words. Tomorrow, your actions will determine whether you live or die." She paused at the doorway and looked back at him. "One more thing, Sam Hartwell. Do not try to run during the night. You are already being watched. Any attempt to leave will be seen as cowardice, and cowards do not deserve the honor of a warrior's death." With that cheerful thought, she was gone, disappearing into the landscape as quietly as she'd appeared. Sam sat alone in his violated kitchen, staring at the remains of his chicken stew and trying to process what had just happened. He was going to be tested. Tomorrow at dawn, an unknown number of Apache warriors, led by Geronimo himself, were going to surround his ranch and do what? Judge his character? Determine his worthiness to continue living on what they considered their ancestral lands? Sam looked around his house, taking in all the small improvements he'd made over the years. The shelves he'd built, the furniture he'd repaired, the books he'd carefully transported from town. It was modest by most standards, but it was his. He'd earned every nail and board through honest work. The smart thing would be to saddle Chief and ride hard for the nearest fort. He could be there by midnight if he pushed it, could bring back a cavalry unit to deal with whatever was brewing. It's what his military training told him to do: when outnumbered and outmaneuvered, fall back to a defensive position and call for reinforcements. But something deeper than military training was keeping him in his chair. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was something else entirely. All Sam knew was that he'd spent too many years running from things, from memories of the war, from the guilt of actions taken in uniform, from the nightmares that followed him wherever he went. This was his stand. This was the place where he'd finally decided to build something instead of just tearing things down. If he ran now, he'd spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he'd had the courage to stay. Sam got up and walked to his weapons cabinet. He had his service revolver, the rifle that Nailnish had borrowed, and a shotgun he used for hunting. Not much against what sounded like a small army of experienced warriors, but it would have to do. Then, he stopped. Nailnish had been very specific about not reaching for weapons. If this was truly a test of character rather than a prelude to battle, showing up armed might be exactly the wrong thing to do. But showing up unarmed might be suicide. Sam spent the rest of the day pacing around his ranch, checking and rechecking his animals, his buildings, his escape routes. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, he finally made his decision. He would stay. He would meet whatever was coming with as much courage and dignity as he could muster. And if he died tomorrow, at least he'd die on his own land, defending something he'd built with his own hands. As night fell over the New Mexico territory, Sam Heartfelt sat on his porch and watched the stars appear one by one in the vast desert sky. Somewhere out there in the darkness, warriors were gathering. By morning, he would know whether his encounter with She Who Brings Rain had been a blessing or a death sentence. Either way, there was no turning back now. Sam didn't sleep that night. He tried, lying on his bed fully clothed with his boots on, but every sound outside made him bolt upright. The wind rustling through the mesquite trees sounded like footsteps. The distant cry of a coyote could have been a signal between warriors. Even the settling creaks of his own house seemed ominous in the darkness. Around 3 a.m, he gave up pretending and made coffee. Strong, black coffee that would keep him alert for whatever was coming. As he sat at his kitchen table sipping from his tin cup, Sam found himself thinking about his father. Jacob Heartfelt had been a different kind of man than his son turned out to be. A farmer through and through, content with his small plot of Ohio land and his simple life. He'd never understood Sam's restlessness, his need to see what was beyond the horizon. When Sam had announced his intention to join the cavalry and head west, his father had just shaken his head sadly. "Some men are born to wander, I suppose," he'd said. "Just remember, son, a man's got to stand for something, or he'll fall for anything." Sam hadn't understood what his father meant at the time. He'd been too young, too eager for adventure and glory. Now, sitting in his kitchen waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring, he finally got it. This was what his father had been talking about. This moment when a man had to decide what he truly believed in and whether he was willing to risk everything for it. The first hint of light was showing in the eastern sky when Sam heard them coming. It wasn't loud, the Apache were famous for moving silently when they wanted to. But Sam's years of military service had trained him to pick up subtle sounds that most people would miss. The whisper of leather against brush. The soft snort of a horse being held back from grazing. The almost inaudible scrape of metal against stone. Sam stood up slowly and walked to his front window. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. They seemed to rise from the earth itself like ghosts materializing in the growing light. First one, then 5, then dozens of mounted warriors appeared along the ridgelines surrounding his ranch. They came from every direction, north, south, east, and west, forming a perfect circle with his buildings at the center. As the dawn light grew stronger, Sam could make out more details that made his military mind catalog threats almost automatically. These weren't young hotshots looking for glory. These were experienced fighters, men who had been at war for most of their adult lives. Their weapons were well maintained, their horses were prime stock, and their positioning showed tactical knowledge that would have impressed any cavalry officer. Some carried traditional bows and arrows, their quivers full of steel-pointed shafts. Others had rifles, not the old trade muskets that inferior warriors might carry, but modern repeating rifles that were probably better than what the cavalry was using. A few had both, along with war clubs, knives, and lances decorated with feathers and scalp locks. But it was their sheer number that made Sam's knees weak. Nailnish hadn't been specific about how many warriors would come, but Sam counted at least 150 mounted men in the circle around his ranch. And there were more still arriving, materializing out of the landscape like they'd been part of it all along. 300 warriors, just as the legends would later claim. In the center of the eastern group, Sam spotted a figure that made his blood run cold. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the man's bearing and the way the other warriors deferred to him. Geronimo himself had come to witness whatever was about to happen. The legendary Apache leader sat his horse with the casual ease of a man who had been fighting longer than Sam had been alive. His hair was still mostly black despite his age, and he wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and items taken from fallen enemies. Most unsettling of all were his eyes. Even from 100 yards away, Sam could feel the weight of that gaze measuring him, evaluating him, deciding his fate. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The warriors simply sat their horses in perfect silence, creating a human noose around Sam's property. The message was clear: there was no escape, no cavalry charge that could break through that ring of steel and determination. Then, Nailnish appeared. She rode out from the group behind Geronimo, her massive frame making her horse look like a pony. But it was a warhorse, Sam realized, bigger and stronger than most cavalry mounts, bred for carrying warriors into battle. She rode with the same casual confidence as the men around her, and Sam noticed that her position near Geronimo indicated considerable status within the group. Nailnish guided her horse to within 30 yards of Sam's front porch and stopped. For a moment, she simply looked at him through the window, as if taking his measure one final time. Then, she spoke, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Sam Hartwell. Come out. It is time." Sam took a deep breath, walked to his door, and stepped out onto his porch. The sun was fully up now, and he could see the faces of the warriors surrounding him. Some looked curious, others hostile, but all of them looked deadly serious about whatever was about to happen. "I'm here," Sam called back, proud that his voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. Nailnish nodded approvingly. "You did not run. That is good. Running would have meant death before the sun reached the mountains." She gestured toward the spring where they'd first met. "We will go to the sacred water. There, in the presence of the spirits and the warriors, you will be judged." Sam walked down from his porch and toward his horse, but Nailnish held up a hand to stop him. "You walk," she said. "A man who would claim ownership of sacred places must prove he is worthy to set foot on them." So Sam walked. With 300 Apache warriors watching his every step, he made his way across the desert toward Devil's Spring. It was only half a mile, but it felt like the longest walk of his life. Behind him, he could hear the soft sound of horses following, maintaining their perfect circle formation as they moved. The spring looked different in the morning light, somehow more significant than it had during his routine water runs. The pool was crystal clear, reflecting the blue sky like a mirror. Water bubbled up from the underground source with a gentle sound that seemed almost musical in the desert silence. Nailnish dismounted and walked to the edge of the spring. The other warriors maintained their circle but stayed mounted, ready to respond to whatever might happen. Geronimo guided his horse closer, close enough that Sam could see the weathered lines on his face and the intelligence in his dark eyes. "Kneel by the water," Nailnish instructed. Sam hesitated. In his military experience, kneeling was something you did when you surrendered, and he had no intention of surrendering. But something in Nailnish's expression suggested this was about something other than submission. Slowly, Sam knelt beside the spring. The water was so clear he could see individual pebbles on the bottom, could see tiny fish darting between the rocks. Nailnish began to speak, but not in English. She used Apache words that Sam didn't understand, her voice taking on a rhythmic, chanting quality. Other voices joined in, first a few, then dozens of the warriors adding their voices to what was clearly some kind of ceremonial ritual. As the chanting continued, Sam began to understand that this wasn't just about him or his ranch. This was bigger than that. The warriors weren't just here to judge one white man's worthiness to live among them. They were here to decide whether it was possible for their two peoples to coexist without one destroying the other. The chanting stopped, and silence fell over the gathering like a blanket. Nailnish looked down at Sam with an expression he couldn't read. "The water speaks to those who know how to listen," she said quietly. It remembers everything that has happened here. The buffalo that came to drink before your people killed them all. The children who played by its banks before they were taken to your schools. The warriors who stopped here on their way to battles they would not survive. She knelt beside him, her large frame somehow graceful despite its size. But it also remembers other things. Acts of kindness between enemies. Moments when understanding was possible. Times when the spirits whispered of a different path. Nailnish reached into the spring and cupped some water in her hands. "Drink," she said. "And tell us what the water remembers about Sam Hartwell." Sam looked at the water in her hands, then at the 300 warriors surrounding him. This was it, the test Nailnish had warned him about. But what kind of test was it? What was he supposed to say? Then, he remembered something from his cavalry days, a conversation with an old Apache scout named Miguel who had worked with the army. Miguel had told him that among his people, water was sacred not just because it gave life, but because it held memory. It connected all living things across time and space. Sam leaned forward and drank from Nailnish's cupped hands. The water was cold and clean, tasting of minerals and stone and something else he couldn't identify. As he straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, words came to him from somewhere deep inside. "The water remembers Lieutenant Sam Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "It remembers a young fool who thought he understood what war was about. It remembers the blood he spilled in the name of duty, and the nightmares that followed him when he tried to sleep." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But it also remembers the Apache children he helped during the winter of the Great Sickness. The food he shared when he was supposed to be guarding prisoners. The times he looked the other way when families tried to stay together instead of being separated." Murmurs rippled through the circle of warriors. Some sounded surprised, others skeptical, but Sam pressed on. "The water remembers Sam Hartwell the rancher, who came here seeking peace and built his life around this spring without fouling it or claiming ownership of what cannot be owned. It remembers the cattle that drink here, and the wild animals that come at night, and the promise he made to share the water with all who need it." Sam looked up at Nailnish, then around at the faces of the warriors surrounding him. "The water remembers a man who was tired of fighting and wants only to live quietly among the spirits of this place. A man who respects the sacred nature of this spring and asks only to be allowed to continue caring for it." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, Geronimo himself spoke, his voice gravelly with age but carrying absolute authority. "Stand up, Sam Hartwell." Sam rose to his feet, his legs shaky from kneeling and from the adrenaline coursing through his system. Geronimo guided his horse closer until he was looking down at Sam from only a few feet away. "You speak of sharing water and respecting sacred places," the Apache leader said in careful English. "But words are wind. Actions are truth. Will you prove your words with your actions?" "How?" Sam asked. Geronimo smiled, and it wasn't entirely reassuring. "You will see. Return to your house now. We will remain here for 3 days. If, when the sun rises on the 4th day, you have proven worthy, we will leave in peace. If not..." He didn't need to finish the threat. Sam nodded and began walking back toward his ranch house, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes following his every step. Behind him, he could hear the warriors dismounting and beginning to set up what appeared to be a temporary camp around the spring. As he reached his porch and turned back to look, Sam realized the full magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a test of his character, it was a siege. For the next 3 days, he would be completely surrounded by some of the most feared warriors in the Southwest, with no possibility of escape or rescue. Whatever test Geronimo had in mind, Sam would face it alone, with nothing but his wits and his courage to see him through. He could only hope that would be enough. As he stepped inside his house and closed the door behind him, Sam Hartwell began the longest 3 days of his life. The first day of the siege began with an unsettling quiet. Sam had expected war cries, demands, or at least some indication of what the warriors surrounding his ranch intended to do. Instead, they simply maintained their positions in a perfect circle around his property, as motionless as statues carved from the desert stone. From his kitchen window, Sam could see several groups of warriors who had dismounted and appeared to be setting up temporary shelters near the spring. They worked with the efficiency of men who had done this countless times before, creating a camp that looked like it could be maintained indefinitely. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every time Sam moved from one room to another, he could feel eyes tracking him through the windows. When he stepped outside to check on his cattle, the sensation of being watched by hundreds of hostile observers made his skin crawl. But nothing happened. The warriors made no aggressive moves, issued no demands, didn't even seem particularly interested in what he was doing. They just watched. And waited. Around midday, Sam discovered what the first test might be when he went to check his water barrels. They were nearly empty. He'd used most of his stored water over the past few days and hadn't been able to make his usual trip to refill them. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be a problem. He'd simply load his wagon and make another run to the spring. But the spring was now surrounded by 300 Apache warriors. Sam stood looking at his empty barrels and felt the cruel elegance of the situation. Water was life in the desert, and the Apache controlled his only reliable source. If he wanted to survive the siege, he'd have to approach the spring where his enemies were camped and ask for what he needed to live. The question was whether this was a trap designed to give them an excuse to kill him, or a genuine test of his willingness to trust in the promise of shared water that Nailnish had extracted from him. By late afternoon, with his throat parched and his cattle beginning to show signs of thirst, Sam made his decision. He hitched his horses to the wagon, loaded his empty barrels, and drove toward the spring. The warriors watched his approach with interest but no apparent alarm. As he got closer, Sam could see that they'd organized their camp with military precision. Horses were picketed in designated areas, weapons were close at hand but not immediately threatening, and sentries were posted at regular intervals around the perimeter. Near the spring itself, a group of older warriors sat in a circle, apparently engaged in some kind of council meeting. Sam recognized Geronimo among them, along with several other men whose bearing suggested they were leaders of various bands or clans. Sam brought his wagon to a stop about 20 yards from the water's edge and climbed down slowly, keeping his hands visible. Several warriors stood up and moved closer, but none of them drew weapons or made threatening gestures. Nailnish emerged from the group around Geronimo and walked toward Sam. In the bright afternoon sunlight, her impressive height and commanding presence were even more striking than they'd been in the dim light of dawn. "You need water," she observed, looking at his empty barrels. "Yes," Sam replied simply. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "The spring is surrounded by Apache warriors. Are you not afraid to come here?" Sam considered the question seriously. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "But my cattle need water, and so do I." "You said the water belongs to all living things." "I'm hoping you meant that." Something that might have been approval flickered in Nailnish's dark eyes. She turned and spoke rapidly in Apache to the warriors who had gathered around them. Sam couldn't understand the words, but the tone seemed to be one of explanation rather than command. When she turned back to Sam, her expression was neutral. "Fill your barrels. But, understand, this water comes with obligations. You drink Apache water, you accept Apache hospitality. That creates bonds that cannot be broken lightly." Sam nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant. He drove his wagon closer to the spring and began filling his barrels, acutely aware that dozens of warriors were watching his every move. The work that normally took him 20 minutes seemed to take forever under their scrutiny. As he worked, Sam noticed details about the camp that his military training automatically catalogued. These warriors were well equipped and well organized, but they were also showing signs of having traveled hard and fast to get here. Some of the horses showed evidence of long rides, and several of the men had the hollow-eyed look that came from too little sleep and too much tension. This gathering hadn't been planned weeks in advance. Something had driven these various bands together quickly, probably the army attack that Nailnish had mentioned. Which meant emotions were running high, and the potential for violence was greater than it might otherwise be. When Sam finished filling his barrels, he turned to find Geronimo himself standing nearby, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "You are a careful man," the Apache leader observed in his precise English. "You see much." "Military habit," Sam replied. "Hard to break. Good habits should not be broken. They keep a man alive." Geronimo stepped closer, close enough that Sam could see the scars on his weathered hands and the intelligence burning in his eyes. "Tell me, Sam Hartwell, what do you see when you look at my warriors?" It was obviously a test question, but Sam wasn't sure what answer was expected. He decided to go with honesty. "I see men who have been fighting for a long time," Sam said slowly. "Men who are tired of war but don't know how to stop. Men who have lost family and friends and are looking for someone to blame. Men who are proud of their heritage and angry that it's being taken from them." Geronimo nodded slightly. "And what do you think they see when they look at you?" "The enemy," Sam replied without hesitation. "A white man on their ancestral lands, taking their water, grazing his cattle where their buffalo used to roam. A symbol of everything that's been stolen from them. Yet you came here for water anyway." "I had to. My cattle would die without it. I would die without it." "And you, or Nailnish, anyway, said the water belongs to all living things. So you trust the word of your enemies?" Sam considered that question carefully. "I trust the word of honorable people, regardless of whether they're my enemies or my friends. From what I've seen, you and your people are honorable, even if we're on different sides." Something shifted in Geronimo's expression, though Sam couldn't quite identify what it was. The Apache leader turned and walked back toward the group of council members, leaving Sam to wonder whether he'd passed or failed whatever test had just occurred. The second day brought a different kind of challenge. Sam woke to find that some of his cattle had wandered closer to the spring during the night, drawn by the scent of water. They were now grazing peacefully within the Apache perimeter, apparently unbothered by the presence of the warriors. From his porch, Sam could see several young Apache men examining his cattle with professional interest. They were clearly evaluating the animal's condition, bloodlines, and market value. Cattle theft was a time-honored Apache tradition, and Sam's small herd represented considerable wealth by their standards. But nobody made any move to drive the cattle away or claim ownership of them. They simply watched and waited to see what Sam would do. The smart thing would be to go retrieve his cattle immediately, before the situation could escalate. But something held Sam back. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was his growing understanding that every action he took was being carefully evaluated by hundreds of eyes. Instead of rushing out to collect his cattle, Sam went about his normal morning routine. He fed his horses, repaired a bridle that had been broken for weeks, and even spent some time reading on his porch. All the while, he kept one eye on his cattle and the warriors surrounding them. Around noon, one of the younger Apache warriors approached his porch. The man was probably in his 20s, with the lean build and alert eyes of a seasoned fighter. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle, but there was also a curiosity in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what to make of Sam. "Your cattle are fat," the warrior observed in broken English. "Good grass and plenty of water," Sam replied. "Makes for healthy animals. They would bring much in trade." "I suppose they would." The warrior studied Sam's face, as if trying to read his thoughts. "You are not worried we will take them?" Sam met his gaze steadily. "If you were going to steal my cattle, you'd have done it already. The fact that you're talking to me about them instead suggests something else is going on." A smile tugged at the corner of the young warrior's mouth. "You think like Apache. Maybe that is good, maybe that is bad." He turned and walked back toward the camp, leaving Sam to puzzle over what the exchange had meant. Were they testing his willingness to defend his property? His ability to remain calm under pressure? Or were they simply curious about this strange white man who didn't react the way they expected? The answer came that evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Sam was sitting on his porch, watching the play of light and shadow across the desert, when he heard the sound of cattle being driven. Looking up, he saw his entire herd being gently guided back toward his barn by a group of Apache horsemen. The young warrior who had spoken to him earlier rode up to the porch and dismounted. "Your cattle were thirsty," he said matter-of-factly. "We took them to water. Now they are full and content." Sam stared at him in amazement. Instead of stealing his cattle, the Apache had taken care of them. They'd provided water and probably salt as well, judging by how healthy the animals looked. "Thank you," Sam said, and meant it. The warrior shrugged. "Water belongs to all living things. This includes cattle, even cattle owned by white men." As the Apache horsemen rode back to their camp, Sam realized he'd just witnessed something extraordinary. These weren't just warriors, they were men who understood that strength sometimes meant showing mercy, that true power lay in the ability to choose restraint when violence would be easier. The third day brought the most difficult test of all. Sam woke to the sound of horses and voices outside his house. Looking out, he saw a group of Apache women and children approaching his ranch under the escort of several warriors. They were clearly refugees, their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces showed the hollow-eyed look of people who had endured terrible trauma. These, Sam realized, were probably survivors of the army attack that Nailnish had mentioned. Families who had lost their homes, their possessions, possibly their loved ones in the violence that had sparked this gathering of warriors. The group stopped about 50 yards from his house and made no move to come closer. They simply waited, as if expecting something from him. Sam understood immediately what was being asked of him, and why this was the hardest test of all. These people needed help, food, shelter, medical attention. But helping them would mark him forever as a traitor to his own race, a white man who aided hostile Indians. If word got back to the territorial authorities, he'd be branded as a renegade, possibly hanged as a collaborator. On the other hand, turning his back on people in need would prove that all his talk about peace and humanity was nothing but empty words. Sam looked at the faces of the women and children, saw the fear and exhaustion there, and felt something break open inside his chest. These weren't enemy combatants or savage raiders. They were human beings who had lost everything and were now dependent on the mercy of strangers for their survival. He walked into his house and began gathering everything he could spare. Blankets, food, medical supplies from his small kit, even some clothes that might fit the children. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had to offer. When he emerged from his house with his arms full of supplies, Sam saw that Nailnish had joined the group of refugees. She watched his approach with an expression he couldn't read, but her presence somehow made the moment feel even more significant. Sam distributed the supplies as best he could, using gestures and the few Apache words he'd picked up over the years to communicate with people who spoke little or no English. A young mother with a baby accepted a blanket with tears in her eyes. An elderly man nodded gravely as he took a shirt that would help keep him warm during the cold desert nights. When he'd given away everything he'd brought, Sam found himself face to face with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She had the same dark eyes as all Apache children, but there was something in her expression that reminded him of his own sister at that age, a mixture of curiosity and caution that spoke of natural intelligence. The girl said something in Apache that Sam didn't understand, but her tone was clearly a question. Sam looked helplessly at Nailnish, who translated. "She wants to know why you help us when your soldiers killed her father." The directness of the question hit Sam like a physical blow. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that the world is more complicated than simple divisions between good and evil? How do you justify the actions of people who share your skin color but not your values? Sam knelt down so he was at the little girl's eye level and spoke as gently as he could, knowing that Nailnish would translate. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "I'm sorry that people who look like me hurt your family. I can't bring him back, and I can't change what happened. But I can try to help you now, because that's what I think your father would want me to do." The little girl listened to Nailnish's translation, then stepped forward and touched Sam's face with one small hand. She said something else in Apache, and this time Nailnish smiled as she translated. "She says you have kind eyes, like her grandfather had. She thinks the spirits sent you to watch over this place." Sam felt tears building behind his own eyes and had to swallow hard before he could speak again. "Tell her that I'll do my best to be worthy of that trust." As the refugees were led away to rejoin the main camp, Sam noticed that many of the warriors who had been watching the exchange looked thoughtful rather than hostile. He'd passed some kind of test, he realized, though he still wasn't sure what the ultimate consequences would be. That night, as Sam sat on his porch looking out at the campfires that dotted the area around the spring, he reflected on the past 3 days. He'd been tested in ways he'd never expected, not just his courage or his fighting ability, but his humanity, his willingness to see past old prejudices and respond to people as individuals rather than as symbols. Tomorrow would bring the dawn of the 4th day, and, with it, Geronimo's judgment. Sam still didn't know whether he'd done enough to earn the right to stay on his land, or whether he'd simply managed to delay the inevitable. All he knew for certain was that he tried to be the man his father had raised him to be, someone who stood for something more important than his own comfort or safety. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. As the stars appeared overhead in the vast desert sky, Sam Heartfelt prepared for what might be his final night on the land he'd come to love. The 4th dawn broke with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Sam had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing his small house and trying to prepare himself for whatever judgment awaited him. As the first light crept across the desert, he could see the Apache warriors stirring in their camps around the spring, preparing for what would either be his execution or his acceptance into something he didn't yet fully understand. Sam dressed carefully in his cleanest shirt and pants, then checked his appearance in the small mirror above his wash basin. If this was to be his last morning, he wanted to meet it with dignity. He'd made his choices over the past 3 days, and he wouldn't change any of them even if he could. The sound of approaching horses drew him to his front window. A delegation was riding toward his house, not the entire force of warriors, but a significant group led by Geronimo himself. Nailnish rode beside the legendary leader, her imposing figure somehow both reassuring and intimidating in the morning light. Behind them came others Sam recognized from the past few days, the young warrior who had spoken about his cattle, several of the older men who had been part of the council meetings, and, surprisingly, some of the women and children he had helped the day before. Sam stepped onto his porch and waited. There was nothing else to do now but face whatever was coming with as much courage as he could muster. The group stopped about 20 feet from his porch, and, for a long moment, nobody spoke. Sam could hear the distant sounds of the main camp breaking up, horses being saddled, equipment being packed. It seemed the 3-day siege was coming to an end, one way or another. Finally, Geronimo dismounted and walked closer to the porch. In the clear morning light, Sam could see the lines of age and hardship etched into the Apache leader's face, but also the sharp intelligence that had made him such a formidable opponent for so many years. Sam Heartfelt, Geronimo said in his careful English, 3 days ago, you knelt by the sacred water and spoke of what it remembered about you. Do you remember what you said? Yes, Sam replied, his voice steadier than he felt. You spoke of sharing water with all who need it. You spoke of respecting the sacred nature of this place. You spoke of wanting to live quietly among the spirits. Geronimo paused, his dark eyes never leaving Sam's face. Words are easy. But, for 3 days, we have watched your actions. Sam waited, not trusting himself to speak. We have seen you come to Apache water when you needed it, trusting in promises that could easily have been lies. We have seen you remain calm when your cattle grazed among warriors who could have taken them without effort. Most importantly, we have seen you give aid to Apache families who had lost everything, knowing that such actions could mark you as an enemy of your own people. Geronimo stepped closer, close enough that Sam could see the old scars on his hands and face, testament to decades of warfare. These actions speak louder than your words, Sam Heartfelt. They tell us that you are not like the other white men who have come to take our lands. They tell us that you understand what it means to live in harmony with the sacred places. Sam felt his heart pounding but still didn't dare to hope. There was something else coming, he could sense it in the tension that still filled the air around the assembled Apache. But, Geronimo continued, and Sam's heart sank, understanding and action are different things. You have shown that you can be trusted as an individual. The question now is whether you can be trusted as an ally. I don't understand, Sam said quietly. Nailnish dismounted and joined Geronimo, her massive frame somehow graceful despite its size. The attacks on our people have not stopped, she said. More soldiers come from the east. More settlers arrive every month, bringing papers that say they own what cannot be owned. Our sacred places are being defiled, our children stolen, our elders driven from lands where their ancestors are buried. She gestured toward the horizon, where the morning light was revealing the vast expanse of desert and mountain that stretched to the limits of vision. This cannot continue. We must find a way to protect what remains, or we will be nothing but stories told around white men's campfires. Sam began to understand what they were asking of him, and the magnitude of it made his knees weak. You want me to help you fight the government? Not fight, Geronimo corrected. That path leads only to more death. We want you to help us find another way. You know the white man's world, understand their laws and customs. You could speak for us, help us navigate their legal systems, perhaps find ways to protect at least some of our sacred places through their own processes. You want me to be a go-between, Sam said, the full implications beginning to dawn on him. A translator between two worlds. More than that, Nailnish said. We want you to become Apache. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sam stared at the two leaders, trying to process what they were asking. To accept would mean abandoning his old life completely, casting his lot with people who were considered enemies by his own government. He would become a wanted man, a renegade, someone who could never return to the white world without facing charges of treason. But to refuse would mean abandoning people who had just shown more honor and wisdom in 3 days than he'd seen from his own government in 3 years of military service. It would mean turning his back on everything he'd learned about himself over the past few days. What exactly are you proposing? Sam asked. Geronimo smiled, and, for the first time since Sam had known him, it was a genuinely warm expression. We are proposing that you become the guardian of this spring and the lands around it. Not as a white rancher with papers from Tucson, but as an Apache waterkeeper, someone who protects the sacred places and ensures that the old ways are not forgotten. The white authorities will never accept that, Sam pointed out. The white authorities will never know, Nailnish replied. To them, you will still be Sam Hartwell, the rancher. But, to us, and to the spirits of this place, you will be something more. You will be the bridge between worlds, the one who helps us find ways to survive in the new time that is coming. Sam looked around at the faces surrounding him, warriors, women, children, all watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hope to skeptical evaluation. These people had trusted him with their lives by coming here, had shown him levels of honor and humanity that challenged everything he'd been taught about savages and civilization. What would this mean, practically speaking? Sam asked. It would mean that this ranch becomes a neutral ground, Geronimo explained. A place where Apache people can come for water, for shelter, for help when they need it. It would mean that you use your knowledge of white man's law to help us protect other sacred places. It would mean that you become part of our extended family, with all the obligations and protections that brings. Sam thought about the little girl who had touched his face the day before, about the refugees who had lost everything to military attacks, about the warriors who had shown such restraint and wisdom over the past 3 days. Then, he thought about his old life, the loneliness, the nightmares, the sense that he was drifting without purpose through his remaining years. If I agree, Sam said slowly, there's no going back. The army will consider me a traitor. Other settlers will see me as an Indian lover. I'll be cut off from my own people forever. Yes, Nailnish said simply. But, you will gain something in return. You will become part of something larger than yourself. You will have a purpose that matters. And, you will have the protection and loyalty of people who value honor above comfort. Sam closed his eyes and thought about his father's words from so many years ago, a man's got to stand for something, or he'll fall for anything. This was his moment to stand for something that mattered, something that transcended the petty divisions and hatreds that seemed to drive so much of human behavior. When he opened his eyes, Sam looked directly at Geronimo and spoke the words that would change his life forever. I accept. The transformation of Sam Hartwell into something new began immediately. The assembled Apache erupted in a mixture of celebration and approval, not wild whooping like Hollywood movies would later depict, but the dignified expressions of satisfaction that came from people who had made a difficult decision and seen it validated. Nailnish stepped forward and placed a large hand on Sam's shoulder. From this day forward, you will be known among the Apache as Tubaishchi, he who shares water. It is a name of honor, one that carries great responsibility. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sam had experienced. Under Nailnish's guidance, he was given traditional clothing to wear alongside his regular ranch clothes, a beautiful shirt decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments that had belonged to a warrior who died fighting for his family's freedom. He was taught words in Apache that would identify him as a friend to any band that might encounter him. He was shown symbols that could be left at water sources to indicate they were under protection. Most importantly, he was inducted into the complex network of relationships and obligations that bound Apache society together. Over the following hours, as the main body of warriors prepared to disperse back to their various territories, Sam learned the practical aspects of his new role. His ranch would become a way station for Apache travelers, a place where they could obtain water, food, and shelter without fear of betrayal. In return, he would be protected by the most formidable fighting force in the Southwest and given access to information networks that spanned hundreds of miles. The young warrior who had spoken about his cattle approached him during the preparations. "You have chosen a difficult path, Tubaishchi," he said with a slight smile. "But also an honorable one. We will remember this day." As the sun reached its zenith, the great gathering began to break up. Warriors mounted their horses and rode off in small groups, heading back to hidden camps scattered throughout the mountains and deserts of the Southwest. The transformation was remarkable. Within an hour, the area around Devil's Spring looked almost exactly as it had before the siege began. But everything had changed. Sam stood by his spring, wearing his new Apache shirt over his rancher's pants, and watched the last of the warriors disappear into the landscape. Geronimo and Nailnish were among the final group to leave, and both approached him for final words. "Remember," Geronimo said, gripping Sam's hand in the white man's fashion, "you are now responsible for more than your own survival. Apache families will depend on you for help when the white man's law becomes too harsh. You must be wise as well as brave." Nailnish's farewell was characteristically direct. "The spirits of this place have accepted you," she said, looking toward the spring where all of this had begun. "But acceptance must be earned again each day. Live with honor, Tubaishchi, and the water will remember your deeds long after your bones have returned to the earth." As the final riders disappeared into the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor, Sam found himself alone at his ranch for the first time in 4 days. But it wasn't the same kind of aloneness he'd experienced before. Now he was part of something larger, connected to a network of relationships and responsibilities that stretched across the entire Southwest. The legend of the giant Apache woman who took his water had become the legend of the white rancher who chose to share it. In the years that followed, Devil's Spring would become known among both Apache and sympathetic whites as a place where the old hatreds could be set aside in favor of something better. Sam Hartwell, now known as Tubaishchi to friends and he who shares water to those who told stories around campfires, had found his purpose at last. It wasn't the peaceful retirement he'd originally sought, but it was something far more meaningful, a chance to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. As he walked back toward his house, Sam noticed that someone had left a gift by his front door. It was a beautifully crafted water jug, decorated with symbols that he was only beginning to understand. Attached to it was a small piece of paper with a message written in careful English, "For the man who proved that water belongs to all living things. May your well never run dry, and may your courage never fail. From the families you helped when help was needed most." Sam smiled as he picked up the jug and carried it inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. But tonight, he would sleep peacefully for the first time in years, knowing that he had finally found his place in the world. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite trees around Devil's Spring, carrying stories that would be told and retold for generations. Stories of a time when enemies became allies, when understanding triumphed over hatred, and when one man's choice to share rather than hoard changed the course of history in a small but significant corner of the American West. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that legends are not born from grand gestures or epic battles, but from ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when the moment calls for courage. Sam Hartwell had been given such a moment, and he had not let it pass unused. The spring continued to bubble up from deep underground, its clear water reflecting the endless sky and carrying the memories of all who had drunk from its sacred depths. And, somewhere in the vast network of Apache camps scattered across the Southwest, warriors and medicine women and ordinary families spoke with respect of the white man who had learned what it truly meant to share the water of life.